From the beginning of R811 it was clear to the shrewdest observers that France and Russia were on a collision course. Some have even antedated the process and claimed that the failure of the Russian marriage project at the beginning of Rate Row and the subsequent match with Marie-Louise was the invisible Rubicon. But it is possible to go even further back and claim that the disappointing conference at Erfurt in October R808 was the beginning of the end. The failure of the Russian marriage then becomes the occasion rather than the cause of a downward spiral in relations. The Tsar had both political and economic grievances arising from his entente with Napoleon. Politically, the emperor refused to allow Alexander carte blanche in Turkey and kept postponing the promised division of the Ottoman Empire, on the grounds that possession of Constantinople would make Russia a Mediterranean power. He also irritated the Tsar by enlarging the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, flirting with Polish nationalists, and threatening to revive an independent Poland, something totally unacceptable to the Russians. In both cases Napoleon was being dog in the manger. He could not have a viable Polish kingdom or defeat Turkey without Russian support, yet he refused to collaborate with Alexander in seeking a rational settlement. Further political irritants in Rate Row were French annexation of the Hanseatic towns and the Duchy of Oldenburg, to which the heir apparent was the Tsar's brother-in-law, and the installation of Bernadotte as King of Sweden, which Alexander mistakenly thought meant an extension of French military power on his northern flank. Lest all this should suggest an innocent, peace-loving Tsar Alexander forced reluctantly into war by an expansionist Corsican ogre, it must be emphasized that Alexander was systematically duplicitous in his dealings with Napoleon and had Promethean ambitions of his own. Despite his professed admiration for the emperor, the one and only significant reform Alexander took from Napoleon was to ape his method of modernizing the apparatus of repression and introducing a secret police force. Alexander managed to be both fool and knave, a coward who was unable to stand up to the Dowager Empress, and feared that the fate he had meted out to his father would be visited on him. The Tsar was an essentially stupid man masquerading as an intellectual. He had the besetting sin of indecisive tyrants, in that he agreed with the last person to speak to him. This explains why Talleyrand was able to twist him round his little finger. But there was another dimension to Alexander's essential stupidity. He was a religious maniac and, like later Tsars, easy prey for quacks, charlatans, gurus and perfect masters. Alexander was in any case scarcely master in his own house for, apart from pressure from the virulently anti-Bonapartist coterie around the Dowager Empress, he had to face the fact of the Army High Command's hatred of Napoleon and the objective interests of the business community. Russia's economic interests were threatened both by the expansion of French influence to the Baltic and by the continental system. The blockade of England destroyed the Russian export trade in corn, hemp, wood, tallow, pitch, potassium, leather and iron. France meanwhile was neither offering alternative outlets nor supplying Russia with the goods she needed. Instead she sent luxury goods like spirits, perfumes, porcelain and jewelry. French traders in more basic necessities found it easier, cheaper and more predictable to find markets in Italy and Germany, where they had the might of the Grand Army to back them. This was the context of the Tsar's ukase in December I8EO, when he effectively barred French luxury imports by imposing high tariffs and opened his port to neutral shipping. By the beginning of I8II, relations between Tsar and Emperor were tense. Prince Poniatowski, Napoleon's faithful Polish captain, warned the French that Alexander was preparing a preemptive strike against the small portion of the Grand Army that remained east of the Elbe. The intelligence was correct. Alexander had sounded his advisor Prince Adam Czartoryski about the possibility of suborning the Poles to his side, but Czartoryski replied that the price was an independent Poland. After a few tentative overtures to Austria, Prussia and Sweden which led nowhere, Alexander decided on a policy of wait and see. A guarded correspondence with Napoleon ensued. On the 28th of February I8II the emperor wrote him a letter which was superficially cheerful and friendly but which contained a sting in the tail. Referring to Alexander's virtual abandonment of the continental system, he warned of terrible consequences if the Tsar sought a rapprochement with the British. Alexander answered noncommittally on the 25th of March, justifying his ukase by the crisis in Russia's maritime trade and the fall in the exchange rate of the ruble. Napoleon decided that war with Russia was the only solution. It has sometimes been said that Alexander's duplicity, intrigues and expansionism forced conflict on an unwilling French emperor, but, the Tsar's despicable nature notwithstanding, there is no warrant for this view in sober history. The truth is that Napoleon welcomed the looming clash of arms. From the beginning of I8II the Ordnance Department, and especially Bader Daub's Topography Department, was busy providing up-to-date maps of the terrain in western Russia. Danzig was made the center of a gigantic collection of war material sent there from eastern France and the Rhineland. The emperor showed the way his mind was working when he saw Y=E Kurikin, the Russian ambassador, the most ferocious dressing down in an audience at the Tuileries on August I8II, which recalled the stormy scene with Lord Whitworth in I803. The occasion was Alexander's suggestion that he be given part of the Duchy of Warsaw. "Don't you know that I have 800,000 troops?" Napoleon yelled. "If you're counting on allies, where are they?" There is a slight hint of protesting too much in this imperial show of bravado. There is more than a little evidence that Napoleon felt he was pushing open the door to a dark room never seen before. His spies told him that Talleyrand openly predicted that France would fail in a war with the Russians. Captain Leclerc, his statistical expert, warned him of the dangers of campaigning in Russia and reminded him of the unhappy fate of Charles XII of Sweden, annihilated at Poltava in I-709 during an invasion of Russia. Bonaparte's ambassador in Russia, Louis de Caulaincourt, warned him several times in very strong language that he would be making a very serious mistake if he fought the Russians on Russian soil, and correctly conjectured that the Russians would employ the Fabian tactics used by Wellington in Spain. Tired of Caulaincourt's Cassandra-like prophecies, a tetchy emperor finally recalled him in June I-8II. The indomitable Caulaincourt, one of the few people who emerges with unblemished credit from the saga of I-8II, tried his utmost to preserve the Tilsit Agreement, even when this meant falling foul of his imperial master. During a tense 5-hour debriefing interview when Caulaincourt returned from Russia in June I-8II, the emperor lost patience with his envoy when he kept insisting that Alexander wanted peace. All Caulaincourt's advice was shrewd, but his master would not listen. Caulaincourt predicted with uncanny accuracy what the impact of a Russian winter would be like and repeated the Tsar's confident boast that in a war the Russians would lose in the short term but win in the long, if only because Bonaparte could not afford to be absent from France for the 2 years it would take to subdue the warriors of the steppes. Napoleon swept aside all these objections and continued to prepare for war. But there was a significant lacuna in Napoleon's preparations from the end of August until mid-November I-8II while he mulled over all the implications of the proposed war. First he traveled to Compiègne for a 3-week stay. Then on I-8 September he followed a now familiar itinerary through Weimar, Ambleteuse, Calais, Dunkirk, Ostend, Flushing, Anvers and Gorkum to Utrecht and Amsterdam. Anxious to see for himself this land from which he had expelled Louis, he remained in Amsterdam for 2 weeks before setting out on the 24th of October for the completion of the journey. After visits to The Hague, Rotterdam, the shadow of Loo, Nijmegen and Arnhem, he crossed into Germany for stopovers at Dusseldorf, Bonn, Liège and Mézières before returning to St. Cloud on II November. His mind was now made up. The continental system had to continue, and war with Russia was its logical expression. Why did Napoleon embark on a course of action so fraught with danger and ultimately so fatal to his prospects? Not even Hitler made the mistake of fighting an active war on 2 fronts, since there was no war in Western Europe when he invaded Russia in I-94I. Yet Napoleon launched into the vast open spaces of the Russian interior at a time when he was already losing a major war in Spain. There was a rational element in his decision, but it seems to have been overwhelmed by multifarious slivers of wishful thinking, fantasy, and self-destructive impulses. In his rational moments, Napoleon argued that a Russian campaign was necessary to maintain credibility and to extinguish British hopes. In the first place, if Russia was allowed to flout the continental system, others would soon follow her example, and the entire strategy for defeating England would be subverted. Secondly, England still sustained herself with the hope of another continental coalition, with Prussia and Austria cowed. Her only plausible potential partner was Russia. It followed that a military defeat of Russia would finally convince the British that Bonaparte was invincible, and force them to sue for peace. Thirdly, Poland needed to be converted into a strong state, with a weak Russia on her borders, so that the French Empire could not be threatened from the east after Napoleon's death. Many observers are convinced that even beneath this seeming rationality there lurked a second-order irrationality. Was it not almost suicidal to double the stakes just when the game seemed to be going against him? The continental blockade had not worked, and seemed unlikely to work. The attempt to close one door on England had led to the unforeseen debacle in Spain. What might not invasion of Russia bring? This has led some historians to argue that Napoleon was once again engaged in double or quits. On this view, his power base in France was becoming precarious, he was at loggerheads with the notables, and the economic crisis and continuing war in Spain had made him so unpopular that he needed a war to distract France from its internal woes and unite it behind a victorious emperor. But there is evidence of still deeper currents of irrationality and of self-destructive behavior. It is unexpected to find, so late in his reign, the resurgence of the Oriental complex, yet it is clearly on show in the bizarre remarks made to the Comte de Narbonne early in 1812, an eccentric piece of behavior explicable only because Narbonne was himself an oddity, a great noble, reputedly the illegitimate son of Louis XV and one-time war minister to Louis XVI, who had fallen under the Bonaparte spell. This is Napoleon, the end of the road is India. Alexander was as far as from Moscow when he marched to the Ganges. I have said this to myself ever since St. Jean d'Acre. Just imagine, Moscow taken, Russia defeated, the Tsar made over or assassinated in a palace plot. And then tell me that it is impossible for a large army of Frenchmen, and their allies to leave Tiflis and reach the Ganges. Essentially all that is needed is a swift stroke of a French sword for the entire British mercantile apparatus in the East to collapse. Narbonne's private comment on this was, "What a man! What ideas! What dreams! Where is the keeper of this genius?" It was halfway between Bedlam and the Pantheon. The Oriental complex was only one of many centrifugal fragments indicating a core personality under great strain, suggesting perhaps that things were falling apart and the Napoleonic center could not hold. A host of psychological interpretations have been offered for Napoleon's state of mind on the eve of 1812. Those who see Bonaparte as the existentialist defying fate, and declaring that nothing is written stress the way he liked to reinforce his identity through action, and the challenge of an impossible adventure. This is plausible given that Napoleon himself admitted he had had a visitation from his familiar Red Man who warned him not to invade Russia. To defy the Red Man would reveal the emperor as a Prometheus, refusing to be bound by the iron laws of determinism. Others see Napoleon as a self-doubting neurotic posing as a conqueror and trying to prove that his worst fears about himself were not true. In a similar vein, Freud argued that 1812 was the ultimate self-destructive act in which Bonaparte, guilty for jettisoning Josephine, compassed his own downfall. Consciously, the divorce of Josephine signified to the superstitious emperor the loss of his luck, and unconsciously triggered a need to be punished. It is tempting to dismiss this as fanciful, but there is the curious fact that, after a 2-year absence, Napoleon suddenly visited Josephine at Malmaison on the 30th of June 1812, just days before setting out on campaign. Certainly the thesis of keeping depression at bay can be sustained circumstantially from the following remarks quoted by Roederer: "I care nothing for St. Cloud or the Tuileries. It would matter little to me if they were burned down. I count my houses as nothing, women as nothing. My son is not very much. I leave one place, I go to another. I leave St. Cloud and I go to Moscow, not out of inclination or to gratify myself, but out of dry calculation." If the disastrous decision to go to war with Russia was in some sense a symptom of Napoleon's declining psychological well-being, his physical health was also declining. After all, 40 is 40 was one of the emperor's authentic remarks, perhaps indicating some alarm at his own rapid and premature decline. Those who had close contact with him in 1812 reported that he was woefully unfit, and had grown fat from daily 4-course meals. Menneval spoke of hypertrophy of the upper body, with a great head on massive shoulders, but small arms, no neck, a pronounced paunch and a lower body that seemed too slender to support the torso. One of the hidden factors working against the success of the 1812 campaign was the emperor's ill health. Loath to leave his carriage, he spent many hours on his couch undressed and came down just before the decisive battle of the war with a bad cold and dysuria. Throughout September he was like a skeleton on horseback, nursing a temperature, a constant cough, breathing difficulties and an irregular pulse, and suffering acute pain in emptying his bladder. From early 1812 the drift to war was all but inevitable. Realizing that this time his forces would not be able to live off the land, on the 13th of January he ordered Lacue, his director of war administration, to supply enough provisions for an army of 400,000 men for 50 days. The basic provision was supposed to be 20 million rations of bread, and the same of rice. Additionally, 6,000 wagons, either horse or ox-drawn, were to carry enough flour for 200,000 men for 2 months, and for the horses 2 million bushels of oats, enough to feed 50 mounts for 50 days, were to be supplied. Needless to say, the emperor did not say how such a vast commissariat was to be assembled in time for a spring campaign and seems almost to have believed that the resources could be conjured out of thin air. Meanwhile, the flower of the Grand Army was earmarked for the coming campaign. The elite French battalions were all in I, 2 and 3 Corps, commanded respectively by Devout, Oudinot and Ney, together with the Guard and Murat's cavalry. This made up the 250,000-strong 1st Army Group. 2nd and 3rd Army Groups were to guard frontiers and lines of communication, and provide reinforcements. IV Corps under Eugene de Beauharnais was basically the Army of Italy with the stiffening of French and Spanish regiments. The faithful Poniatowski led his Poles in V Corps while Rainier led the Saxons in 7 Corps. Command of VI Corps went to Gouvion St-Cyr who, after near disgrace in Spain, made a remarkable comeback in Rate R2 and ended with a marshal's baton. Victor, commanding mixed battalions of French, Germans and Poles in IX Corps, was another reprieved after less than satisfactory service in Spain. Yet another mixed corps served under Augereau in XI Corps, while the Westphalians and Hessians in 8 Corps had Vandamme as their taskmaster. This by no means exhausted the units detailed for service in Russia, for there were also 4 cavalry corps, 2 of them led by Murat and a 2nd support army under Jérôme. Finally, Napoleon himself would command the S0000 immortals of the Old and Young Guards. The corps were of widely differing manpower. Oudinot's had 37,000 men, but Devout's was nearly twice as large with 72,000. While these massive military preparations went on, a complicated game of diplomatic maneuvering continued, in which Alexander won every round on points. On the 26th of February, Rate R2 Napoleon sent the Tsar's special envoy Tchenchev back to Russia with a threatening message for Alexander, but a police raid on Tchenchev's apartments threw up the alarming intelligence that the Russians had all along had a well-placed mole at the heart of Bonapartist decision-making, who had revealed all the most important intelligence about French military strength and troop movements. This development seriously harmed the valiant attempts of Caulaincourt to cobble together a compromise peace. Caught between the giant egos of Napoleon and Alexander, he was the true unsung hero of Rate R2. In any case, the Tsar was intransigent in his reply on the 27th of April. His terms for Russia's return to the continental system were impossibly steep: French evacuation of Prussia, compensation for the loss of the Duchy of Oldenburg, and the creation of a neutral buffer zone between the two power blocs. Napoleon regarded the answer as more of an insult than serious diplomacy. Some historians have claimed that, since Alexander was prepared to revoke his ban on French luxury goods, reimpose the blockade on British ships, and withdraw his protest about the Duchy of Oldenburg, Napoleon was not justified in regarding the note as a casus belli, but this is naive. Alexander had no qualms about war, for he thought he could win. The screws were turned on the Prussians and Austrians to provide fighting men for the Russian front. They acquiesced, and a 30,000-strong Austrian army under Schwarzenberg actually fought in the campaign after Metternich advised the Austrian emperor that he had no choice but to comply. Frederick William of Prussia was forced to provide Z0000 troops and huge quantities of stores or face the occupation of Berlin by the French, but the Austrians and Prussians also secretly advised Alexander that they were simply acting under duress, and would bide their time until they could openly proclaim an alliance with Russia. Napoleon's overtures to Britain also ran into the sand. He proposed peace in Spain on the basis that Portugal would be restored to the Braganzas, and Sicily given to Ferdinand, ex-king of Naples, provided Joseph remained as king of Spain. Since the British already held Portugal and Sicily, they could not understand what was supposed to be in the deal for them, and replied firmly that Ferdinand must be restored at once as king of Spain before negotiations could even begin. The truth is that they were beginning to grow confident that they could win the Peninsular War anyway, especially if Napoleon was busy in Russia. Other diplomatic developments in the first half of Rate R2 were equally disastrous for France. Chafing under the continental system and the insulting French occupation of Swedish Pomerania in January Rate R2, the Swedish nobility put pressure on their new king. With Bernadotte on the throne, they were preaching to the converted. At last he had the chance for revenge on the man who had humiliated him so many times. With singular relish, Bernadotte brought Sweden over to the Russian side in April Rate RZ, after securing a Russian promise to help him conquer Norway. Yet another body blow for Napoleon was the Treaty of Bucharest in May Rate RZ, making peace between Russia and Turkey. In the space of a month, Alexander had secured both his northern and southern flanks and could concentrate all his forces against Napoleon in the center. On the 9th of May Rate R2, Napoleon left St. Cloud with Marie-Louise and set out for Dresden, accompanied by 300 carriages conveying an itinerant court. Traveling via Chalons and Metz, he was at Mainz on the 12th of May, then proceeded to Dresden by way of Erzberg, Bayreuth and Freiburg, arriving there at midnight on the 16th of May in a triumphal procession, with the King of Saxony providing the honor escort. The poet Heine was one who witnessed the imperial passage through Germany, and wrote of his first glimpse of Bonaparte. He was sending them to Russia, and the old grenadiers glanced up at him with so awesome a devotion, so sympathetic an earnestness, with the pride of death, T. Caesar, mortuary T. Salutant. Napoleon remained in Dresden for 2 weeks while his envoy Count Narbonne conducted feudal negotiations at Vilna with the Tsar's plenipotentiaries. On St. Helena, Napoleon described this fortnight in Dresden as the happiest time of his life, since all the rulers of Europe, except the Tsar, George III and the Sultan, were there to pay homage to him. He took over the Saxon king's Rococo palace and filled it with wagon trains of French tapestries, wines, porcelain, china, glass and furniture brought from Paris. Hundreds of French cooks worked on delicacies culled from all over the empire for the delectation of Marie-Louise, and the imperial nobility, now seemingly given the final seal of approval with the presence in Dresden of the great science of the ancient regime nobility, the Turennes, the Montesquieu's and the Noailles. After leaving Dresden on the 29th of May, the emperor proceeded via Posen and Thorn to his main base at Danzig, where he arrived on the evening of the 7th of June. Almost his first encounter was with Murat, a man he had seen little of in recent years. The emperor had not forgotten his disloyal intrigues in R809 and often toyed with the idea of deposing him as king of Naples. On one occasion he had actually summoned him in order to dismiss him, but Murat, tipped off by one of his spies, decamped for Italy to avoid the confrontation. By the time a lame excuse about crossed messages had been offered, Napoleon's mind was on something else and the Murat problem went into abeyance. But now, seeing again his disloyal brother-in-law, the emperor greeted him coldly. He began with stern face and bitter words, then changed his tone to that of a man whose close friend has let him down badly. He finished with words so tender and affecting that Murat was deeply moved, and near to tears. Once again it is worth stressing that Napoleon Bonaparte, his occasional harsh excesses aside, was a deeply human and forgiving man, too forgiving for his own good, some would say. At Danzig, Napoleon took stock of the situation on the eve of the Russian campaign. Altogether he had some 675,000 troops under arms, including reserves and those on supply and garrison duties. Aside from the French soldiers there were 40,000 Italians, J0000 Portuguese and Spanish, Swiss, Dutch, Illyrians, Croats, Lithuanians and, above all, vast numbers of Germans. One corps was entirely Polish, another entirely Saxon, another entirely Austrian, yet another was Westphalian and Hessian, and still another largely Prussian. Morale in the polyglot army was high, and desertion levels low, partly because of the draconian punishments visited on those taking unauthorized furlough, but it was the local population who paid the price. In Prussia and Poland the French army exacted, commandeered and requisitioned without any regard to the fragility of local economies, behaved arrogantly and refused to pay for anything. Napoleon, exhibiting the insouciance with detail that was to mark him throughout 1812, did nothing to check these excesses. There was another fortnight's delay at Danzig before Napoleon crossed the border into Russia. During these days the emperor traveled for no discernible reason to Marienburg and Königsberg and on to Gumbinnen and Witoski. This was the first of the many baffling delays he allowed himself in 1812, and the reason has always puzzled Bonaparte students. The most plausible conjecture is that he postponed the invasion until June because, with U0000 horses and 90,000 draft oxen to feed, he needed to wait until the steppes were lush with grass. Another view is that he was concerned that the medical infrastructure was inadequate, expecting heavy casualties. He was alarmed to find at Danzig that the requisite surgeons, ambulances, medicines, bandages and stretchers were all lacking. During this period of phony war the emperor's thoughts often went back to Marie-Louise. It is curious how often this cynical man turned uxorious when campaigning, for the tone of his letters to his wife irresistibly recalls the correspondence with Josephine when he was conquering Italy in 1796–97. There was genuine regret in the letter he sent to her when he discovered she was not pregnant again, as he had hoped, and there was much more in the same sentimental vein. On the 9th of June he wrote to her from Danzig, "My health is very good. Despite my cares and exhaustion, I feel there is something missing, the sweet habit of seeing you several times a day." But now he had to think seriously about his Russian strategy. His main aim was to prevent the junction of the army under Barclay in the north with that under Prince Bagration in the south. The idea was to push hard towards Moscow on the Orsha land bridge, the watershed between the Dnieper and Dvina, which ran straight to the heart of Russia, interrupted only by the Berezina, one of the Dnieper's important tributaries. He calculated that he could achieve this end by crossing the river Niemen on a narrow front, with flanks protected by MacDonald's corps at Riga and Schwarzenberg's Austrian corps at Minsk. This would also allow him to cut off Bagration if the Russians took the offensive. These were minimum aims, but there were also best-case scenario maximum aims in the emperor's mind. He planned to engage Barclay's army by pushing forward with the left flank while falling back with the right. Barclay would presumably then fall back and move south to avoid encirclement, but would be unable to link with Bagration, as he would be pinned by Jerome and Schwarzenberg. Bagration would be forced to advance to attack Bonaparte's right, at which point the more powerful French left and center would circle round and cut communications with Moscow. Both Russian armies would then be herded into a pocket around Grodno and eaten up, bringing the war to an end in 12 days. It was a good plan, but it depended on exact timing, close communication and secure lines. Most of all it envisaged blitzkrieg warfare. But Napoleon's previous victories had all been won with smallish armies operating over smallish spaces. He had never tried to coordinate vast armies over distances of hundreds of miles. Had he campaigned sustainedly in Spain he would have saved himself from this error. It was clear that too many things could go wrong. Messages failing to get through, commanders failing to obey orders to the letter, and that execution could never match conception. The plan also assumed that the Russians would give battle as soon as the French crossed the frontier, whereas the Tsar had already decided to make his stand 200 miles inland along the line traced by the rivers Dnieper, Dvina and Berezina. In retrospect one can see that the Russian campaign was fatally flawed from the outset, and that Napoleon had not thought through most of the problems confronting him. His most straightforward blunders were political. He would not have had to face two armies in the first place if he had not allowed Alexander to outmaneuver him in Sweden and Turkey simultaneously. To turn the campaign into a crusade for liberty he should have given Poland its independence, and freed the Russian serfs. The reluctance to turn the Duchy of Warsaw into an independent Poland is all the more surprising now that he no longer had to worry about giving offense to the Tsar. As for his stated reasons for not freeing the Russian serfs, these seem almost fatuous. To state that manumission would have turned conservative Europe and the right against him ignores the obvious fact that they already were against him, albeit mainly covertly. As for the argument that the ferocious and mindless mujiks would have committed terrible atrocities against their former masters, the only consequence of the emperor's scruples in this regard was that the serfs visited atrocities on the French instead. But perhaps more serious were the mistakes in the sphere where Napoleon regarded himself as a master, strategic planning and execution. Quite apart from his old fault of ignoring the seasons and the elements when drawing up his plans, the emperor proved singularly defective in logistics, an area where his mathematical ability should have come into its own. The preparations at Danzig were impressive, and the port held the desired 400,000 rations for 50 days, but no one had worked out how to get these supplies to a front that got more distant day by day. The factors of delay and distance meant that even if a food convoy got to the front, it was likely already to have consumed 1/3 of what it was transporting. Horses were a particular problem, for they needed 9 kilos of forage a day each, including the oats they were pulling for the vast numbers of cavalry mounts and artillery horses. When set to graze on unripe rye, they simply died in thousands. Since the army moved much faster than its supply convoys, it was constantly outstripping its own commissariat. The food wagons proved unsuitable to Russian roads, really no more than rutted tracks, and broke down in areas where there were no replacement horses or carts to hand. The consequence was not only that vast amounts of stores were dumped but that mills for grinding corn and ovens for baking bread could not keep up with the army. It was not long before starvation loomed, for the initial 20-day ration was consumed before the due date. For a while the troops were able to slaughter cattle, but then came the conundrum of living off the land where there was nothing to pillage. The lack of the firm smack of discipline from the emperor did not help. Absurdly complacent, he allowed his officers to bring servants and luxuries with them. The men in the ranks took their cue from their superiors, and the result was a huge subsidiary army of camp followers, themselves wasting the army's substance. An army corps accompanied by hundreds of cattle on the hoof thronged the roads and blocked the progress of the food and ammunition convoys behind. Both militarily and logistically, Napoleon would have done better with an army of half the size of the host he took into Russia. Hitherto, Napoleon's victories had been gained with an army of maximum size of R0,0000, which permitted the speed and flexibility that produced an Austerlitz. Significantly, the emperor had never before commanded an army of the size he led onto the steppes, and seems blithely to have thought he could achieve a six-fold increase in his strike rate. It never seems to have occurred to him that a six-fold increase in numbers would augment the problems of command and coordination exponentially. This applied particularly to logistics. In a nutshell, the Grand Army was too big for the resources of Russia and its infrastructure. The problems of roads and food supply were so great that the most sober analysts have concluded that Napoleon's 1812 adventure was doomed from the start. It was an impossible dream, something impracticable before the advent of railways and the telegraph. Since the problem of time was pressing, Napoleon should have crossed the Niemen in May. His failure to do so caused him problems which he, typically, attributed simply to bad luck. As the summer heats began, disease struck at the army. 60,000 died from dysentery, diphtheria and typhus before ever a Russian was sighted or a shot fired. A believer in omens, Napoleon should have heeded the portents, but the superstitious Corsican did not even heed the warning when he was thrown from his horse in the late afternoon of the 23rd of June. A hair ran between the hooves of his steed, though privately he brooded on the conspiracy against him by paranormal forces. Yet there was still time to change strategy and save face. One possibility was to cross the Niemen for a massive raid in force, and then return to the frontier for the winter. The Tsar would then be informed that the same thing would happen every year until he came to heel. It is impossible to avoid the comparison between the crossing of the Niemen by the Grand Army on the 23rd of June and the invasion of Russia by Hitler's Wehrmacht just one day earlier, 129 years later. In both cases, dictators had underestimated the enemy, failed to think their strategy through, and started the campaign too late. But there the comparisons end, for the Germans in 1941 achieved striking early success with their blitzkrieg, while the Grand Army trekked for over a month before coming to grips with the enemy, and the 5-day march to Vilna would have alerted a more circumspect commander of the possibility of ultimate disaster, for the warning signs were all there. On the first day of the campaign, 130,000 infantry and cavalry crossed the Niemen on 3 pontoon bridges. Napoleon himself crossed on the 24th and made his headquarters at Kovno, ready for the advance on Vilna. But on the march itself, the poor organization of the army was already apparent. The the troops were indisciplined and consumed all 4 days' rations on the first day, so that long before they got to Vilna they were collapsing with hunger and exhaustion, plodding along muddy tracks, past polluted wells, over collapsing bridges, maddened by lack of fresh meat and weakened by diarrhea. The ravenous soldiers began to drop in their tracks. Desertion and even suicide were common, and losses ran at 6,000 a day. Even more seriously for the future of the campaign, the horses died in thousands, and between 10 and C0000 perished on the Vilna road. Arriving in Vilna on the 28th of June, Napoleon made another of his unaccountable long stopovers, apparently thinking he had penetrated far enough into Russia to defeat the armies of Barclay and Bagration piecemeal. As soon as he entered the city, he sent Oudinot and Ney in pursuit of Barclay, and Devout and Jerome towards Minsk to intercept Bagration in a pincer movement. But the lightning maneuvers of yore were not possible with exhausted men, exposed to huge variations of temperature between day and night, scarce local supplies and tortoise-like supply convoys. Devout did his best, but Jerome's ineptitude and slowness allowed Bagration to escape the forked trap being prepared for him. Devout raged at the incompetence of his colleague, and an angry emperor wrote to his youngest brother on the 4th of July with a stiff reprimand, and in order to come under Devout's command in future. The absurd and prima donna-ish king of Westphalia responded by throwing up his command and returning in dudgeon to his realm. Devout meanwhile dogged Bagration's heels through Minsk and Bobrusk, but could not catch up with him. The Russians were adopting a scorched earth policy, withdrawing in face of the Grand Army, but their later claims to have adopted this Fabian approach deliberately were mere rationalization. The plain truth was that they were afraid of meeting Napoleon in a pitched battle when he had such a marked superiority in numbers. Against the 450,000 Napoleon brought across the Niemen, the Russians could initially pit only 160,000 men. This was yet another reason why Napoleon's vast host was too big for the job. The Tsar had at first wanted to stand and fight by an entrenched camp at Drissa, but his advisors warned him that this would be playing to Bonaparte's strength. For the time being, Alexander left the fighting to Barclay and Bagration, while Napoleon remained in Vilna. His army staggered on towards the next objective, Vitebsk. They were soon caught up in another marching nightmare as the excessive heat of the day and the biting cold of night united with violent summer hailstorms to harass and lash the benighted French troopers. They trekked through dark pine forests or through fetid marshes, up to their waists in foul-smelling water. Discipline collapsed and insubordination was rife. Another 8,000 horses died on this grueling march between Vilna and Vitebsk. General Belliard, Murat's chief of staff, reported directly to the emperor that he would soon have no cavalry left, since the horses were dying both from shortage of fodder and the violent oscillations in temperature between daytime heat and night cold. The cattle, too, lacked the stamina for such hard slogging and perished in droves, while the drivers in the supply columns found the going so tough they often sabotaged their wagons, thus reducing desperately needed food supplies. The emperor was not on hand to boost the morale of his men, as he remained in Vilna from the 28th of June to the 16th of July, displaying the same dithering mentality for which he had censured Jerome. Foolishly, he expected every day to hear from Alexander with his terms for surrender. The Russians were quite prepared to play along with this delusion, so that futile diplomatic representations and bogus peace missions shuttled between Vilna and Moscow. While in Vilna, the emperor came under renewed Polish pressure to proclaim an independent Poland, but still he refused, on the ground that he had given his word to his ally Austria. Disillusioned both with Bonaparte's duplicity and his army's exactions on Polish soil, the patriots voted with their feet. The expected extra volunteer corps and guerrilla fighters for the Russian front did not materialize. Leaving Vilna finally in mid-July, Napoleon with a few hard gallops soon caught up with his slow-moving army. Having failed to trap Bagration, he now made Barclay his target. On the 25th of July, Murat caught up with the Russian rearguard and a sharp engagement took place at Ostrovno, a few miles west of Vitebsk, in which both Murat and Eugene performed impressively. Barclay, whose relations with Bagration had always been sour, was stung by the prince's taunts that he always ran away while ordering Bagration to hold fast. He therefore decided to stand and fight and drew up his army in battle order on the 27th of July. Napoleon, aware that he was between the two Russian armies, was overjoyed and looked forward to an easy victory. But he delayed going into action at once and waited for reinforcements to make the victory certain. Next morning, however, there was no Barclay, having learned that Bagration could not arrive to support him and was proposing instead to effect the junction of the two armies at Smolensk. Barclay slunk away in the night, leaving a disconsolate Napoleon empty-handed. The 24-hour delay in joining battle, so untypical of the hero of Lodi, Marengo and Jena, meant that it was the second time in a month that French armies had failed to trap the enemy. Nothing had been achieved. Barclay and Bagration were now free to unite at Smolensk, and 510 meanwhile a further 8,000 horses had died between Vilna and Vitebsk, and 100,000 troops were absent from their units through illness, desertion or straggling.